Hi everyone. I'm very excited to be here. We have some wonderful panelists with us joining today. Um, my name is Ammar Belal. Let me start with a couple of introductions. So my name is Ammar Belal. I am adjunct faculty at Columbia, and I'm teaching a new course that we're offering called Sustainable Fashion and Startup Strategy. And I think as part of the initiative by Columbia to create more nuance and create more conversation beyond the surface around sustainable fashion initiatives, we're really excited to offer this panel. I want to give a shout out to my panelists, and they'll Azfar Hassan, Ayesha Barenblat, and Kerli Kant Hvass for joining us. They're going to be introducing themselves in a moment. Just a brief introduction about myself. I do teach part-time at Parsons as well, and my work centers around social justice initiatives within fashion on the design side, but also the manufacturing side. I am originally from Pakistan, so my background is in manufacturing in the developing world, but then also I'm an MFA grad at Parsons, so I have my own startup, which is called 1432, which talks about agency around profit sharing and transparency within the fashion industry. But that is it for me. We'll start with Ayesha. Ayesha, please tell us about your wonderful work and how you got there.
Hello, everyone. It's so wonderful to talk to everyone here today. So as Ammar said, my name is Ayesha. It's unusual when there are so many Pakistanis represented on a panel. So I'm very excited to be here in your company. Much like Ammar, I grew up in Karachi and with family that ran garment factories. So came with that ethos of understanding manufacturing in this industry, but I've spent some 20 years really focused more on the sustainability side. And for those of you whether graduate or undergraduate that are studying sustainability, that's really where my love for this work was awoken. It was at the UC Berkeley campus, getting a degree in public policy. We were sort of the home bed to United Students Against Sweatshops and sort of a lot of conversations in those early days. But I think coming from Pakistan, having understanding of manufacturing, it was always interesting to me how sustainability is taught very top down. And in many ways, it feels very colonial in this notion of, the big bad manufacturers and suppliers, we are somehow going to get them to take these Western sustainability values. When on the other hand, what we were seeing is a pressure cooker situation of, prices being pushed down further and further, speed to market. And as fast fashion really took hold, just a lot of conditions that lead to human exploitation and environmental degradation. So, 2 seconds on my background. I have worked both on the inside with fashion brands, making the business case for sustainability, with mass retailers like Walmart and Target, to high street brands that are both sustainable and not sustainable. I spent some time then on the policy side working with the International Labor Organization. We had a program called Better Work, where we brought government, unions, and brands to the table to address working conditions and essentially shore up protections for workers. And in all my years of doing this work in sustainability, I realized there's a seat missing at the table. And that's all of you as everyday citizens, as shoppers who love fashion, who want to enjoy fashion without giving you actionable ways to make a difference. And so in my current incarnation, I am the founder of REMAKE. We are here to really center environmental justice and worker justice when it comes to sustainability and give consumers actionable ways to hold brands accountable, but to also wear your values and buy better. So I'm thrilled to be here. Really looking forward to this conversation with Kerli and Azfar and Ammar.
Thank you so much for joining us, Ayesha. That's wonderful. Kerli, you want to go ahead next?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for inviting to be part of this exciting conversation here. And so my name is Kerli, and I'm an external lecturer at Copenhagen Business School in Europe, and independent consultant under my own brand called Evaluate. And my background is Estonia, the former Soviet Union, close to Scandinavia, here in Europe. And I grew up in a family where my mom worked in a garment factory, and she did most of my clothes, all my clothes. She took a grandmom's old jacket, turned the inside out, a way of upcycling. So I grew up with valuing clothes. Like, I saw how much time and love and consideration went to make a beautiful piece of garment. And I also grew up consuming a lot of secondhand clothes. So when I moved in around 20 years ago to Scandinavia, I kind of got shocked how much clothes people have. And also the bins on the street, that you actually throw clothes into a bin, the donation bin. I didn't understand the concept. And that's where my journey started. I was curious, like, what happens with all those clothes? So the last 15 years, I have dedicated my career and passion on the used clothing, the existing clothing, the ones we already have and have consumed. I started it from the secondhand perspective, but 10 years ago, I got an opportunity to do a PhD. So I entered the brand world because at that time, it was the brand's perspective on sustainability was only the supply chain. I mean, the sustainability talk ended where you bought the piece of garment in the store, but the whole system of collection and reuse and repair and upcycling and downcycling, recycling, that was not part of the conversation. So I did an industrial PhD at Copenhagen Business School, where I studied business model innovation and how fashion brands should incorporate the reuse and recycling mentality and strategies into their businesses. At that time, we didn't have a term called circular economy. And after brands, 4 years ago, I have now spent time on the end of life part, basically the collection, the charity sector, the reuse, repair, and mechanical and chemical recycling. Kind of understanding the system through research, but also consultancy and facilitation of partnerships along the value chain. So I'm the representative of my expertise and interest and passion lies in the existing garments, not the production. Thank you for being part of it. I'm very excited for our organization.
Thank you for coming, Kerli. Thank you so much. Azfar, it's all you.
Okay, thanks. So my name is Azfar. I am in Pakistan, and basically our primary job has been to represent large Fortune 500 companies in sourcing strategies and to develop their source base in the supply chain. So we've been engaged in Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, the subcontinent basically, and the Middle East to help them do their purchasing and to set up a supply chain. It's been 30 years since I've been doing this, and we basically have had almost every major name brand work through us. We've also helped Nike fix some of their soccer ball issues, when they ran into problems in Sialkot, and worked with the ILO on the tripartite, the government, the ILO, and Nike in that. My growth has been organic, so we have grown into two different areas. One is we have a software company that provides digitization and tools for more transparent transport of information, collection and transport of information with analytics built into them, whether they're on the quality side, production tracking, or CSR compliance side. And then we also have another company which we launched most recently, which is a women's pret brand based on, again, it's a very digital brand. Everything is designed in 3D using virtual samples, and then it's made on order, kind of on-demand manufacturing. So we don't waste anything that goes unsold. And the basic premise there is to promote women in society and to promote their issues through the brand. The brand is called Lulu Sir, and we're very pleased with the progress we've made. But being in this on this journey for about 30 years, I've seen a lot happen in the supply chain in many countries, and it's good that we're discussing this in the panel because there's a lot to say about, voices from this side that never get heard for many different reasons. Anyway, back to you.
Very well put, Azfar. I think you left us at the clincher where we definitely want to hear more about it. But just to phrase our conversation, I know we're going to run out of time as you guys share your insights and your interactions in the industry. But I phrased just to phrase our conversation, when I asked you guys to join, I thought of breaking up our sustainable fashion space amongst 3 stakeholders, right? And I thought the 3 of you could play those personas really well. And one of them was the consumer side, right? What we can do as stakeholders or participants, as consumers who consume fashion. And I think Ayesha has interacted with the US consumer or activist, or the common citizen, as we like to call it, the average citizen. And Kerli has definitely interacted with on the corporate side of brands in terms of them wanting to do better and what kind of initiatives they've been working on. So just kind of represent initiatives that are existing or failed, whatever failure means, or where they stopped. And us as a stakeholder, like you mentioned, somebody from the supply chain and the factory side, and like you said, more often than not, that voice is so muted and it doesn't get the breadth that it deserves as a key stakeholder. It's kind of been told. Ayesha touched on that as well. So let me kick off this way, and any takers, in your line of work, where do you think in your expertise or in your ecosystem or in your geography, where is the conversation stuck? Or where have you felt frustrated where I wish we can get past this? Where's the gray area? Where's the bureaucracy in each one of your spaces where you feel frustrated with us being stuck? Where's the problem areas? If you guys, anybody would want to touch on that. Azfar, you want to go first if you want, because you left that as
yeah, there's a lot to say. I mean, first of all, I think that this whole topic is extremely complex. There's no simple solution to it. And the second thing is that we've come a long way. I remember, I was with Levi's about 32 years ago when they started their operation here. I helped them tee it up. And at that time, there was this huge incident in Saipan with labor issues where Chinese labor was involved. And nobody knew about it. And that's where the code of conduct was written the first time on how brands and retailers are supposed to behave with their supply chain. So that was the first time initiative was taken. And this was 1992, I think, when the incident took place. We've come a long way since then, but then along the way, we've had some major disasters as well. The Rana Plaza incident, and the fire in Pakistan with Ali Enterprises, and the incidents that keep coming up and propping up with treatment of labor, etc. But I think what we're missing here, in my opinion, is a priority on a dialogue and partnership between the suppliers and the brands and retailers. So instead of a one-sided conversation, it needs to be a dialogue. The other thing is that we don't link rewards with compliances either. When factories do comply with regulations, with desires to improve for the retailers, they do not, their behavior is not reinforced with any kind of partnerships, sustainable partnerships. And unfortunately, those stories go around. So the compulsion to do more and do better is dampened. And and if there was a dialogue, an open dialogue between the suppliers and the customers, the retailers, I think that some of these priorities would be rewritten in light of how we could perhaps be more effective. Because at the bottom line, it is all about affecting human lives in a positive way, not just for the consumers, but also for the workers and for the population where the product is being made. And that's been the dilemma. So there is also a disconnect between how all this is done. In the past, it's mostly been policing and inspections. So it's either you pass or fail, you qualify or you don't qualify. But there is no conversation around capacity building. You know, how do we work together to get more out of you, you know, in terms of cooperation? What are your issues? You know, like a lot of factories here run private hospitals for their staff because the government doesn't do enough. But the brands don't step forward and say, hey, this is a great initiative. It may not come in the media, it may not be something our consumers may be connected to, but it's a human initiative and we'd like to be a part of it. So a lot of those stories go, you know, and they are singularly tilted towards the manufacturers, never get told, because the media plays a big role in it. Whatever the media highlights, there's a reaction to it. So we've been reacting, I think, on the compliance side a lot more than being proactive and seeing the human side of things. That's my take on it.
Thank you, Azfar. I've got a couple of follow-ups, but let us go around one time, and then I think great insights there. Ayesha, you want to jump in?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I completely agree with what Azfar said. So much of this is about the power imbalance. But you know, when I think since you told me to wear the citizen consumer hat, where we're stuck is, you know, the simple truth of it is we are buying too many clothes for too little money and throwing them away too fast. And in the last 15, 20 years, that has really accelerated. I think the MacArthur Foundation did a calculation of 100 billion units of clothes are made today per year, and then 7 out of 10 of those end up incinerated or in a landfill within the first year of production. And so, you know, when we are interacting a lot with our movement building work around getting people to think of themselves as citizens rather than consumers, you know, the first education often is around putting a human face to these issues. I can't tell you how many college campuses I've been at where there's this conversation around, you mean robots don't make our clothes? You know, that there's actually people at the other end of the production line. And so for us, our Made in series, our transparency work has really been about that, you know, going undercover into dye houses, into production hubs, into farms to give people an understanding of the human cost. Because as you start to then do the math, it's like, well, how could this dress or this top cost $15, $20, given all the people that have had to put their labor into it? And especially as you look at the cost of energy, of water, of transportation, it turns out that the one cost that the industry has really treated as a variable cost and continued to look for how they can get squeezed as much as possible is labor. And so, you know, we look at this from a citizen standpoint around humanizing the issues, getting people to care. But when it comes to how do we build a truly just and sustainable industry, I think fundamentally it comes down to wages. You know, we need workers to be able to make more. You know, in Bangladesh alone, the average worker makes $96 a month. In a place like Ethiopia, it's $27 a month. And in the context of COVID, a lot of these issues have really accelerated. You know, one of the things that has really been keeping us as campaigners up at night is at the start of the crisis, brands and retailers canceled upwards of $40 billion in orders that were already shipped in many instances or in production, where the manufacturers had already front-loaded the material cost, in many ways had to make payroll. And what we are seeing across the world is that the risk then starts getting pushed down to fashion's most essential and vulnerable workers. So as factories are shutting down or are unable to make payroll, you know, you are getting reports out of Cambodia, Myanmar, Pakistan of nutrition deficiency, workers are unable to put food on the table. And so I think, you know, for to look at these issues structurally, the part that we as citizens have to pay is to ask, how can this be so cheap? How can I buy less and better? How can I call brands when it comes to greenwashing claims? And on the production side of things, we really need to center this around wages.
Ayesha, that's wonderful. I also wanted to take this opportunity to shout out that your hashtag #PayUp campaign was mentioned in Vogue, and you got a lot of pushback from different brands being like, stop telling us to pay the workers, shut up. But you made enough of a noise to ruffle enough feathers, and you know, you almost got threats. But I leave it to you if you want to mention who who was coming down on you hard, but obviously that meant it was working, right, with your pay up campaign.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is for everyone, you know, where we feel so hopeless in the context of COVID, and, you know, our own lives have been upended, and thinking about, do we as a single citizen voice make a difference? And Pay Up was really an example of solidarity across the industry. You know, when we launched the petition, I, you know, with my homemade sign sitting at home, was like, is anyone going to care? And it turned out that supermodels and greats like Cameron Russell and Ammar Belal dived in to say, yes, I care. You know, 270,000 people signed the initial petition. And so at this point, we have 21 brands who've now agreed to take goods on the original shipment terms, to pay back for the orders that were canceled. And, you know, the brands run the gamut. It's anywhere from H&M and Zara to Levi's, who had changed their payment terms to essentially shore up, you know, some liquidity on their own balance sheets. And we were pushing back to brands to say, this is not the time to do that, because, you know, you might have great second quarter earnings, but this is then the difference between workers deciding if they eat 2 meals or 1. And so for people listening in, it's to say, you know, you all did this. We really think of Instagram as an opportunity to amplify protest. The fact that so many people, every time a brand was trying to talk about social justice or having a flash sale, all the comments were taken up around pay up, pay up, pay up. And unless you pay up, I don't want to buy your goods. And so for me, it was really a silver lining in these dark times of how we can rise in solidarity as citizens and workers and hold this industry accountable.
It's wonderful to hear. It gives me hope around all the cynics around whether consumer behavior can actually make change. But thank you for doing that, Ayesha. Kerli, please join in.
So yeah, so I should have the brand hat on, and so I had the chance to spend like around 5 years in a big corporation, house for 15 plus brands, many of them fast fashion brands. And when I entered the industry, the brand side, I entered with a conversation about the post-consumer, the waste part of it. And I had the most interesting conversations. And as a researcher, you can just come and ask. I mean, you're not hired. You can ask the daring questions. And I remember I had with a male brand, I asked one of the brand managers, basically, so what happens, do you know what happens with this 20 million pieces per year that you're putting on the market? Do you know what happens with them? And the answer was no. I asked, whose responsibility is it to clean up? And it came very fast, it's consumers' responsibility. But the interesting thing was, by the end of the interview, the person said, actually, we do have a responsibility here. So I realized that nobody has ever asked that question. They had never even thought of the end part of the products. And we're starting working with these brands and piloting and developing initiatives on the take back or getting recycled fibers in the collections. Then I would say, as Ammar asked, what's the biggest roadblock? I would say it's the people's mindset. It's the linear, it's a silo thinking. And as Azfar and Ayesha both mentioned, it's the disconnect and it's the complexity. I mean, the big corporations, they're very complex. The value chains, they span across the world. They are complex. They're disconnected. Where do the products come from and where do they go? And in the corporations, there are also people, just nice people. They want to do the best, but the system they are functioning, the way the organizations operating are silos. And very often the sustainability department sits, and I mean, now I think it's getting better, but it still sits maybe under the communications or HR. I mean, it's not part of the strategic management. It's not part of the core business. For example, when I was sitting at the brand, we were never invited to a business strategy meeting. So it's parked in some corner and it will never get across the organization, but implementing and managing circularity requires that you have a cross-functional teams that managers and employees are measured in sustainability. I mean, measuring is you deliver what you are expected, what you ask.
Kerli, I have an interesting question here. Do you think there is a space for sustainable initiatives within brands to sit alongside the same team, which is working on growth? Because, you know, the argument always comes, hey, I'm playing devil's advocate here. You know, I'm the one who's wearing the green tie, but I'm going to push back a little bit. But, you know, brands will argue, oh, we're a for-profit company and we're trying to be as responsible as we can. But how do you see that play out? How do you see, you know, an initiative around being responsible, looking after what you produce? And you, all of you can jump in and making that argument with brands who are chasing growth. And we can talk about what scale of growth or whatever, but how does that pan out in an inherently capitalist structure? What are your thoughts on that?
I had a very good story. I have a very good story for that. I talked to the head of CSR on a big corporation about circularity and textile waste. That was 4 years ago. And he literally looked at me and said, this is your PhD, it's a project. We are running here a for-profit business. It's a capitalist world, and this is what it is. And then I asked him, so if you go to, you're a citizen, you're a consumer, you go to a park or in a forest for a picnic, you have a nice party with lots of food and friends and dance and music. The question is, when you leave the forest, do you clean up? Or do you leave all that party there? And it's the same with the millions of pieces of garments. If you don't even ask in the design phase or while you sell it to the consumer, you think what will happen. I mean, the producer responsibility. So I think there is probably, I mean, not probably, but there is less and less this mentality, because at least from Europe, you can see EU is pushing very much the producer responsibility issues, textile waste issues, the design, eco-design principles. So we are moving in the right direction, but the mentality and the way the industry has been trained and educated, thinking linear, thinking in profit, measuring profit. So I could go on, but we have other interesting panels.
Yeah.
No, I'll just make a comment on that, and then we'll move on to Azfar and Ayesha. But I think in our conversation, you mentioned to me that there is already a big drive for collecting post-consumer garment waste by the public sector. So governments in Europe are being involved to facilitate how they can take back programs. So they're trying to facilitate brands. It's not only a brand's responsibility. On a state level, they're making a push, right? You were telling me about those initiatives, Kerli. And, you know, I think what I'm hearing from you, correct me if I'm wrong, that if we are just going to expect for-profit companies to suddenly wake up and be on the same page for cleanup or start being more responsible, it's going to take a long time to change the mindset. On some level, I understand the state has come in and saying, this is happening. Yeah. Whether you do it or not, you better jump on the bandwagon. You can help get on this bandwagon and do it yourself, but we are going to start collecting anyway. What do you think about those initiatives?
So I had the privilege to be part of, like 7, 8 years ago, to develop one of the take back programs in a brand. So I spent a lot of time researching and also kind of understanding the brand-driven take-back programs. And they are nice, but it's not solving the problem. These are nice small initiatives like a good story, communication, marketing story. The volumes that you collect in these stores is not very, very big. So we need both. We need to make the take-back or the collection convenient for the consumer. So it should be a natural thing that you buy something, and it should be easy and convenient and incentivized also, if the garments still have value, to responsibly pass it on. for the next phase. So Europe, from 2025, all EU countries, they have to establish the separate collection of textiles at the state level. So it's kind of interesting to see. I'm involved or following closely Danish. So Denmark has decided to start doing it from 2022. So they're trying to figure now out what role the charities have, because charities have played a huge role in the past in many developed countries to be the collectors, but charities are not necessarily good to be recyclers. I mean, they're doing it for social purposes. They are not professionally handling them. So it's interesting to see how what kind of systems will be put in place and what role the brands will be taken. I mean, the extended producer responsibility, the EPR, is very much on the table as well in many countries. So we need to regulate the production of all these volumes.
I mean, that's a good segue into Ayesha, something that I was going to ask you, that, you know, Kerli talks about the state making take back or recycling programs more accessible and more convenient. And they're putting the opportunity or the effort on the doorstep of you know, citizens to take part. And, you know, you've worked so much with you know, organizing citizens to demand better. I keep coming across such a level of cynicism many a time where we say, oh, you know, citizens, they say they care, but their purchasing patterns show otherwise. I know Azfar's witnessed that as well. You know, fast fashion grows. We are increasingly consuming, you know, and sometimes it's hard to push back against that, where people will say, yes, you want an ethical shirt, but you still want it to be $7. Look at the buyer patterns. And I think my question is that whether it's, you know, making it convenient for citizens to take back, recycle, how do you, through your interaction, how do you see we get past that? Do you have faith in how we organize citizens to actually make policy change? And how do you respond to that cynicism of consumers wanting fast fashion because it's cheap and effective?
Yeah, I mean, it's so complex, right, as Azfar said, but I do think that, you know, pushing the buck onto consumers to address all these deep systemic things where essentially what we're dealing with is a gap of regulation is really not quite fair. You know, a lot of the young people that I work with, Gen Z, millennials, there's absolutely an interest. It's like one of the biggest search terms is often sustainability. I care, but, you know, there was a question here in the chat around explaining greenwashing. And I think, you know, it's tied to this conversation we're having right now, because brands have really picked up on this consumer increased interest on having ethical and sustainable product, but essentially it's become a marketing exercise. And the thing that we come up with very often with people is just confusion. You know, when it comes to fashion, is organic a good thing? Is fair trade? You know, what is the right materials? Should I be taking back? You know, like take organic, for example, it turns out a lot of our organic cotton is coming from the Uyghur region that has forced labor and is essentially making product with detention camps. And so therein you have, you know, a sustainably marketed product that essentially made with human exploitation. And so one of the things at Remake that we've realized is, how do you make it really easy for people? So the thing that's really searched on our site time and again, where we get the most amount of hits, is our sustainable brand directory. And it turns out if you, as an independent third party, give your seal of approval to say, look, no money exchanges hands, we don't have anything to market this product or that, but these jeans are better, or this t-shirt is better than that, because they're looking at the system more holistically, there's a lot of interest in that. So I think it's still early days for us to be thinking about who's marketing sustainability, who owns the data, and how do we make it easy for customers. And, you know, when it comes to take back, I think the question really, and you, Ammar, being a designer, know this, is it really isn't about the end of life cleanup, because so much of the environmental and human rights mess starts at the design phase, right? And so when we are out there, we're teaching people, you know, buy less. You know, this summer, for example, our community took a no new clothes pledge for 3 months. It turns out 90 days is what it takes to break up with a bad habit. So essentially just unsubscribing from all the fast fashion coupons and not buying anything. And we were able to calculate not just how much climate and how much water we saved as a community of 200,000 people, but also how much money we saved. And that matters. That it turns out, you know, fast fashion may be cheap, but swapping and vintage and consignment or sharing clothes with a friend is even cheaper. And so I think it's almost influencing culture and in some ways being very counterculture when there's a multi-billion-dollar industry that's teaching you in the Amazon Prime world, you know, one click and your impulsive purchase is right here. And so, you know, going back to take back, like one of the questions I asked H&M was, I don't really care how much product you're taking back. What percentage of that ends up in a landfill or burned anyway versus how much do you actually recycle? Because recycling is one of the biggest myths of our time right now. And Kerli, you probably know this, but most of our product is poly blend, right? And so it turns out that taking out a product, even if the thread is polyester, is very difficult to do at an industrial grade level. And so people may feel really good, you know, Marie Kondoing their closet and sending bags and bags off to Goodwill. But it turns out what we're actually needing is companies to be thinking about what are the materials, you know, that you're putting in the product to begin with. Are you thinking about end of life at the design phase? And for us, for the consumers, it's really about what are you buying? Will you wear it at least 30 times? And if you won't, then put it away. And so I think we need all of these pieces to be working. And right now, a lot of the sustainability initiatives are essentially just that, right? They're initiatives, they're marketing programs. And what we're really talking about is a revolutionary and different way of running a business, of fashion to be a service rather than a disposable good. And so, you know, to your last question on are growth and sustainability at odds with each other, I think absolutely so. I cannot name a single Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 company that's wanting to give return to their shareholders that's truly sustainable. You know, we see a lot of very small sustainable companies that have control over their owned and operated facilities that do right by people on the planet. But the minute they get bigger and the minute they get more successful, the minute they're publicly traded companies, the ethos and the value belongs to the shareholders and investors, and the planet and people always come last. And the only way to fix that is through regulation. We're not going to do it with the goodness of all of our hearts, you know?
Thank you for that, Ayesha. I think it's a good segue in what I was going to ask Azfar. And just from the design side, you know, Azfar represents the manufacturers, and you know, as a small scale designer, I might want to have the most sustainable supply chain or the take back program, or I might want to design with circularity in mind. And Kerli and I have spoken about that. But sometimes startup companies just don't have that resource from the supply chain side to do so, right? Access is such a huge problem. A lot of times I think new businesses that might have, or new designers that might want to design with this code of ethics, the sourcing, they need access to that kind of innovation. And funnily enough, I find that a lot of amazing innovation of products which are less carbon footprint heavy are actually made for somebody who has a massive scale and a big footprint. So it's quite paradoxical in that sense that you kind of have to grow to a certain amount to be able to work with a supplier who's having a very recyclable material. And I think Azfar can speak more to that, how brands are doing so. But I will say one thing as a designer, for anybody who's thinking of starting their own business and being ethical, and Azfar is going to tell you an amazing story about organic cotton as well, that contextualizing what is sustainable based on your geography and your footprint is so important. You know, if you go after the cookie cutter explanation of being responsible as a fashion designer, as a company, you're going to lose. You're greenwashing. And when people ask me about sustainability, whether we use real leather or whether it's the material we use, I break it down being like, this is our footprint as a company. This is what our sales are. We're very transparent about the money we have and the money we make. That's what 143 is about. So I'm like, considering this is the money we have and this is what we're selling, this is the most responsible thing to do to support our local economy. Am I, as a brand, outpacing the demand that I've created? Am I promoting wastage? Or am I actually contextualizing the jobs that I'm creating and putting people to work and paying them better than anybody in the country, technically our workers? And then the citizens that are using our product, what is my interaction responsibility with them? And my sustainable pledge as a brand does not need to mirror H&M's or Stella McCartney's or some big, it mirrors, it contextualizes the size that we are, and it's evolving. Our promises and our commitments to sustainability and responsibility have to evolve as your initiative, as your organization grows. It's not something that you sign away as a certification and audit, and you kind of waive it every time to set yourself free if something goes wrong. It's an ongoing commitment as you. So that's kind of my 2 cents. But Azfar can speak more about how sometimes certifications are tainted, and he told me a really good story about organic cotton, that which a lot of brands tend to rely on being like, but go ahead, Azfar.
Yeah, so like there's a lot of different streams that you've spoken about, and I think before I get into the material side, just want to say that we're on the right track for one reason. I mean, there is a lot more digitization going on. The world is becoming digital, and it's breeding transparency. Like every worker in every factory has access to the internet. They're on mobile phones, and very soon these mobile phones will connect to the bigger universe of, and bring them to the consumers as well. It's just a matter of time. So the only problem there is the shame in the initial startup phase, where imagine like there's ugliness behind the window and you've got a curtain in front of it. You don't want to remove the curtain all in one go. So you're waiting till like everything becomes green, but that day will never come. So the effort needs to start in small increments for digitization and for transparency. One example I give you is like in our software side, we developed a solution for COVID practices to ensure that factories followed the SOPs to be for the workplaces to be safe for the workers. And the ILO picked up on this and put it through. A basic premise of that is to empower the factory to conduct their own inspection, but it's followed up with a validation inspection. Now that's just a better way to say you're empowered to judge for yourself who you are. But maybe there's only 2 things in this. One, you could unintentionally, without having knowledge of how to do this audit, give yourself the wrong score. It could be a good score or a bad score, but it will not tally with somebody who's qualified to do it. Secondly, if your intentions are bad, you'll get caught with the validation audit. But it's an opportunity to, put the good guys and the bad guys, call them out. So a better way to do this is to create that partnership where you see the score the factory is assigned to itself in following those SOPs, and then you coach them and train them as to what the real scores should be and how they can bridge the gap between what's perceived and what's actual. So, and if you bring it digitally out in the open, then everybody's seeing it. And initially there will be shame that, hey, I rated myself as 100% A grade supplier, but actually the validation audit called me out as a D grade supplier. But I'm willing, so we should give the space to these people to make progress, to bridge that gap, but take responsibility and charge for the internal matters. And that, I think, is an example of how digitization brings that transparency in real time to the audience. And I think eventually that audience will become the public, the consumers, and not the brands. So it will go all the way through. And that's something that should be encouraged.
One of the things I want to comment on that, Azfar, also is that, do you think that more companies or more factories would come forward with quote unquote shame if we found the revenue stream? Who pays for it? So if I want to be better and I'm willing to admit that, okay, I want to be more responsible, I want better working conditions, I want to use better materials, so on. Do you think I'd be more incentivized to come forward if I know that that's not going to result in me being shamed, called
Ammar,
out?
I get your question, but the shame is on both sides. I think from the brand side, they react to media pressure. They react to risk indices. They're in it for the business. And when the business gets rough because the media starts jumping up and down, they pick up on a story, they react to it. But the real initiative comes from the consumers if they had the knowledge, because that's real power, that's democratic power. So I think if you bring that story directly to the consumers, they will pick and choose the priorities and not the media. And I think that to circumvent that, there is no other way than to build capacities and to work in partnership. You can't hide behind the curtain anymore. So there will be an initiative. The other thing that needs to happen is also from the government side. The governments like the EU and the US need to put people on the table and say, you know, instead of doing these 15 or 20 or 50 different standards and confusing everyone, let's work on unified standards and unified goals and work towards them. And we realize that there is a lot of, you know, like, there's a lot of issues with transparency initially. People are taking shortcuts, etc. But let's identify those spots, give them ample time to fix those, and then, you know, work towards a more ideal world where things are more compliant, whether it's labor issues or safety issues.
Can you speak a little bit more on the standards, Azfar? You've got such great insights on how you spoke about the, you know, a unified standard. And I think when it comes to certification and standards, whether it's organic or GOT certified, they're not very consumer facing a lot of times. Some are not. But can you speak to that about the evolution of the standards and certifications, how that's panned out? Where do you see that going, and how effective they've been in your mind?
Well, I think that right now the industry is itching to try and find a solution, because if you were a supplier, there's like an audit in your factory every second week, somebody's coming in. You're the one who's paying them for those inspections. And you know, those companies that are coming in to evaluate you are in the business too. So they have to maintain a balancing act to make sure some things they can brush under the table and some things they can bring out to make it look like a regular inspection where they're not disturbing the business too much. So over a period of time, it starts to go in that same stream over and over again, and it becomes ineffective because they are inspecting, they're not building the capacity to become better. So here, again, in terms of the number of inspections, and like I said, they're all reactionary. When Saipan happened, the labor issue came up, you know, forced labor, labor quarters, residences of labor. When the soccer ball incident happened in Sialkot with Nike, it was child labor, so focus on child labor. When Rana Plaza happened, it was all about, you know, building safety, you know, what's it built on, how strong are the foundations, everybody's testing it. When the fire incident happened, then it's all about fire doors and fire, but you don't have a holistic picture on this. Like the EU works really well in hazardous materials, for example, and every year they upgrade those, so chemicals are, you know, chemicals found in dyes and chemical, you know, that go into your finishing chemicals that go into fabrics and garments, you know, there's more stringent standards and the world is moving forward. But similarly on social compliance and safety standards, there needs to be a unified approach. So the factories are not submitted to such pain and agony of having to, and in the end, they control these people. They figure out a way to, you know, make the inspector a little more malleable, a little more friendly. And in the end, it's all a useless exercise. You know, it does move itself a little here and there, but I think the movement is not strong enough, not like a partnership should be. And then on the material side, I think, you know, there are some good initiatives. One is the birth of the microfactory and on-demand manufacturing, which is what we're doing in the women's brand. And a lot more people are interested in it, which is because of the digital age and because of these new industry 4.0 technologies, you can manufacture on demand, on site. So imagine like a brand produces for its New York consumers outside New York. They produce in Germany outside in a city out there for the German consumers, but it's produced on demand. You don't produce excessive stuff 6 months in advance and then miss out on the forecast and end up with a huge inventory of unsold goods. So that is one way that you can handle the waste. The other thing is, you know, I read in a news article that Levi's just launched a program of buying back secondhand jeans from consumers. So we are talking about recycling. It's easier to do with the big brands, like you said, but when they set the pace, I think it trickles down to, and then if you were to, set up more of community efforts where the SMEs and the small businesses could take advantage of clusters where, like there are water treatment plants in clusters. The brands don't really go for that a lot, but how many people do you force to set up their own, water treatment? What if like there are 5 factories in a cluster and all of them use one treatment plant? Why isn't that a nice story for the brands? Similarly, like if there is a recycling plant, why can't I use 5 or 6 of my factories to go in and put their cutting waste in and recycle it back as yarns for themselves? So there's a lot that can be done. The push needs to come from governments because they need to standardize some of these practices. And I think the other push is going to come from the consumers as they get bombarded with more information directly from the sources, so which means that they have access to factory floors and the workers too.
So I have a question on the government's front. I know it's an important one, Azfar. And when the push comes from the governments, a lot of times government officials will say, when we try to go negotiate with brands which are placing such huge amounts of production in our economy, we don't have a lot of negotiating power because a lot of the brands, really big brands, are saying these are the amount of jobs that we provide to your economy. So the governments, when they try to tighten labor standards or tighten any kind of regulation in Pakistan, they sometimes the brands are like, do you want us to go to another country or do you want us to stay? You think about it. And somehow when it comes to, when you talk about take back programs of cutting waste, we've got programs like that in New York. Somehow in the United States, we have all those kind of programs, but where they're needed the most, like you're saying in Pakistan with these cluster of facilities, it's harder to get them passed somehow. What are your thoughts on that about governments being able to
exactly. So
negotiate?
what I mean by governments is governments in the developed countries where the markets are, they need to be more proactive. For example, like we have a situation here where we've got piece rate workers. Piece rate workers mean they are employed by and paid for by every piece that they make. So the wages are not paid on a monthly basis. They are like contract workers who come and go. But the brands say that they are eligible for full benefits. Now that's where it gets stuck because the brands don't place consistent production. So in June or in some months like February, January, they'll disappear because it's not the season. So their production tapers off. There's nothing to produce. So what does the factory do? It happens every year. And then when the peak comes in June or July for fall months production, the brands say you have to take 110% of your capacity and deliver it on time. So what do? They go into overtime. When they go into overtime, the brands say, now you're violating compliance rules. So these guys start to lie to each other. They start making up these. We're not transparent with each other because we create circumstances which are impossible to. And this is where somebody needs to come and mediate in the big picture scheme of things, where the governments have to step in and say, we'll mediate and we'll set the norms. Because Pakistan as a country, for example, has to then make and conform its laws to what the brands are demanding. If they're saying we allow no overtime, then their overtime policy becomes strict. And you know what? Factories start lying to the brands, they start lying to the governments. Because if they don't produce those at 110, 120% capacity, the brands will disappear and say, you didn't deliver the goods on time. So
yeah.
These are the issues really.
One of my, okay, last question, because I know this is getting really exciting and interesting. Can you, out of your experience, name in the past 30 years, a country with a huge amount of manufacturing that is successfully transitioned to better practices? So I know you know Pakistan, you know Bangladesh, we can look at Turkey. Can you name a manufacturing country that still ends up manufacturing and I'm not saying it's become Italy with those kind of labor laws, but can you name any examples, whether it's Sri Lanka, and if so, how did they do it?
Yeah, I think, I admire what Bangladesh has done in terms of the amount of lives they've been able to affect in a positive way. We were there 20 years ago, and we've seen the progression of that country. People were so poor, unemployed, and really hungry. There was no food on the table for many families. Today, there's a lot of employment. It went from just a few $1 billion to what, $40 billion of exports right now. It's one of the major exporters. It's created a huge amount of employment. They signed up on the Accord and the other, I forget, but they have the Alliance and the Accord. So they have really done quite a bit. Unfortunately, like I said earlier, it could have been better if it was less one-sided, but they still complied and things move forward. Sri Lanka, on the other hand, and there was a lot of private initiatives by 2 or 3 large companies that set the tone. And in our part of the world and in a lot of the world, if you set an example and it creates success, other people follow. And I think that's one of the golden rules for success as well, that we have to create industry leaders who set good examples. And it's a win-win situation. They prove that following good ethical guidelines does pay off, whether you're big or small. And those have to be reinforced. Unfortunately, it's a lot of times it's the other way around. People get left alone on the street. And that, I think, requires more responsibility on part of the brands. And that's where what I meant by the partnerships. They have to work both ways.
Thank you for those lovely insights. I'm going to try to field a little bit of a Q&A. We're running out of time, but while I do that, Ayesha, Kerli, if you have comments on remarks on what Azfar said, just please jump in.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we have to see is that here we are, a quarter century of voluntary initiatives, codes of conduct, auditing. We've been doing it for 30 years, and how much progress have we made? I think to Azfar's point, it's often a whack-a-mole of, there's issues in different countries, and then we're addressing them depending on what's in the media cycle, but we're not really looking at root causes, right? And so I do think at the end of the day, we should be thinking about who is the auditing industry working for? And right now it's on behalf of brands and paid for by brands. There's an initiative now called Better Buying Initiative, where what they try and do is get factories to rate brands. And I think that's really important because it's turning this conversation on its head to say, well, who pays for sustainability? And you have your procurement people negotiating down to 10 cents a piece. And on the other hand, you're telling me to pay for all these audits and not do overtime. You don't have good forecasting and production planning, but then you're holding me in violation, and you're basically talking 2 sides of your mouth. And so, we are calling for audit data to be in the public domain so that us as citizens, us as worker-centric organizations, we should be the stakeholders of this data rather than it serving as an early warning signal for brands.
And Ayesha, I trust you that we're going to get the public excited about it. I make the analogy with the food industry. Every time you go buy your organic coffee, or you do that, you get a receipt, or you find yourself counting calories, and you look at the food that's going in your body, and you're like, this is very organic and healthy and whatever. Yeah. If you can help, Ayesha, I trust you to get us to think about clothing the same way, that it's in our body or on
our largest organ, right? Our skin. And so it's like, why do we not think about it from a human health standpoint? The chemicals that impact workers also have, early studies show, whether endocrine disruptors or thinking about cancer rates, it matters to the end citizen as well. And I think it's the same when it comes to a lot of these human rights issues. Our slogan is wear your values. And it turns out as we get people to be thinking about, who made it, how was it made, would you want to put that on your body? The answer is absolutely not. I just don't know. And so to Azfar's point, we're currently dealing with, any of these transparency, sustainability efforts. It's all for brands on behalf of brands. And unless we can really regulate some of this and realize that the true stakeholders for this conversation are citizens, because it's our planet, right, at the end of the day, and workers, because they are fashion's most essential stakeholder, that we're going to get nowhere.
That's wonderful. Thank you for saying that, Aisha. Natalie's back. Natalie, shall we try fielding some questions, or we're out of time completely?
Yeah, I mean, we are out of time, but there are a couple of questions have come through. Some of them came up organically just in the discussion, which is great. But one just builds a little bit upon, Ayesha, what you already answered about greenwashing. And can you share some opinions on greenwashing versus taking baby steps towards the right thing to do? For example, H&M has multiple initiatives that help them achieve sustainability and responsibility, but because their initial business model was based off of fast fashion, many people view it as greenwashing. So how do such brands take the right steps if they're constantly accused of greenwashing? And so Ayesha, maybe do you want to start with that?
Yeah, and I'd welcome Curly's perspective here as
Yeah.
well. For us, it's often we look at, the good that you're doing, does it outweigh the bad? And so, when it comes to a conscious collection by H&M, it's to dig in to say, how much percentage of SKUs is that conscious collection versus most of your business model that's the opposite of those values. Similarly, when we looked at, they did a very splashy campaign with MIA, who our community loves as a rapper, talking about take back. But the question we asked was, we don't care how many units you're collecting, how much are you recycling? And that's where it became smoke and mirrors, right? It's like we're collecting a lot, but we're not going to give you those recycling numbers. And so, they do have a more sustainable line now. I think certainly their customers are wanting different from them. We certainly hear, in the context of Pay Up and some of our campaigning in Bangladesh and India, they were the first brand to not be canceling orders. And so we do try and tell the story in a textured way. But the truth is that if the sustainability efforts are just initiatives and not core to your business, and the taking that you're doing in terms of human exploitation and natural resource depletion is far higher than the good that you're putting out in the world, then yes, that's greenwashing.
Yeah, I think H&M is an interesting case. I mean, they're also the corporation that does a lot. I mean, you name an initiative where they are not part of it. When we take the circularity, they are part of strategic investments in recycling. They do a lot of things. They definitely kind of lead the way or set the kind of the pioneering of the brands as well. At the same time, they are also the ones that put the most waste on the market. If you go to a sorting center, then what products are not having reuse value for resale? I mean, a lot of it is fast fashion and H&M. So in a way, their own business model is still linear, but they are trying to, and maybe this is for them is still the learning and experimenting phase. And hopefully they will scale up, or they eventually integrate these principles and initiatives into their core business model. But definitely the volume and the quality of the product is the big elephant in the room, and especially the quality. It's not you can make out of a t-shirt out of an organic cotton, but if the stitching is not good quality, then it's not a sustainable product. So yeah, so I think there is a greenwashing going on quite a lot, and we see more and more. And consumers have to be critical. I mean, we need to ask questions, and we need to be really asking critically, like, okay, you collect back through the take-back system. Where does it go? Where does it actually go? And what will it be made into? Or is that product reusable? So consumers need to be more active, but we need a regulation as well. We cannot expect that the industry will improve without being regulated. So I'm a true supporter of extended producer responsibility. There are different ways how to go about it. France is one example. Sweden, Germany, Holland, they discuss other options. So it's definitely, we need regulations.
Great, thank you. And then maybe we'll just do one final question, because I know that we're over time, but I do want to just give the students a chance to ask you their questions themselves. How can companies get through the initial degrowth pains when they put aside the money to be more sustainable and ethical? I don't know if anybody wants to take a stab at that.
I mean, I guess I can try, and maybe Azfar can join in as well from a corporate. I can start from just a very small startup side. I think this idea of growth and looking at what you want to be and what success looks like, I think it differs from every company to company, which is obvious, right? But I think in my mind, having a very clear vision of what your mission statement and your value as a brand, as a company is really important. And it's important to notice that in my mind, even some of the most successful companies have the ability to grow more. So if you look at the end game, even if you look at a luxury company like Armani or different brands position themselves differently based on what kind of growth they want, what kind of success or monetary success they want, how much do you want to grow? And I don't think a lot of people think about how far they want to go, right? It's like, oh, we want to be a 10 million, 50 million, $100 million company. But I think thinking about that early on, about what you want to be, really sets the tone of how you're going to take your values alongside through that vision of growth. And having that tough conversation with yourself really helps. And I know it's what I'm saying sounds very intuitive and obvious, but I continuously find a lot of entrepreneurs not having that. It's like, I want to go and be successful. And when I cross that bridge and when I have more opportunity to grow, I'll seize that opportunity when it comes and I'll mitigate that. But let me just try to get to that meeting. Let me try to get into that room where somebody might be investing in my company or I'm about to have an IPO. But they don't think about what they're going to do afterwards. But in our small little company, we've gotten plenty of opportunities where they'll be like, oh, do this and you can grow faster, or you can achieve your social impact or your version of success faster. But because we're so intrinsically tied to our values, our sense of growth is alongside our values. And we're okay with not growing or degrowth or stunted growth if our values are compromised. And our values are that we declare our profits and we have to give half of our money away. And that's okay. And it might take more time, but and I think also, as my last thing, I think it makes good business sense. I think growth, you can get a lot of growth, but not have a lot of longevity if you continuously come off compromising the mission statement and the values of your brand. And a lot of brands do that, and they have a good 10-year cycle or 15-year cycle. But how our attention spans are now, and how quickly we get over brands and how saturated the marketplace was, if there's going to be a brand or a company that operates for 50 years, which seems really unlikely, right? Because most of the people who've been around for a very long time are people who were, in the middle part of the previous century. So we should ask ourselves, some of the most successful brands that we see around today, are they going to be around 50 years? Are they going to be around relevant? And I'm talking about brands that have been started in the past 10 or 15 years. I'm not talking about the ones that have been started in the 20th century, who just have a lot of heritage to bank on. So what makes something relevant beyond trend? Are you part of a conversation, or is your value proposition something that gets citizens to say, hey, I respect that commitment. You're beyond trend. So that's how I look at growth. That's how I look at staying true to our mission statement. But I'll heed to Azfar also to remark on that. I think he has something to say about it.
Thank you. And I think we just have time for a short response.
Okay. So I'm a sucker for karma. I think if you have good values, they come back to you in, sustainable business. Your employees respect you better. Your consumers respect you better. And they see through it. And it's not about making that one sale. It's about having a customer for life. And they can only be there for life if they respect you. So, there's no shortcuts to it. You have to work on it.
Can we squeeze one quick response from Ayesha to one of the questions, Natalie, like a super quick one? How is it economical for clothing companies to waste so much finished products and materials? Ayesha opted to answer that.
Yeah, I mean, I think just in the context of COVID, you've seen, how much unclaimed goods. You look at photos that we've seen coming out of Dhaka and India, just reams and reams of them sitting there. And the truth is what Azfar said, where a lot of the risk is put on to suppliers. So suppliers, factories are the ones who often prepay for the material. And then, using the force majeure contract clause, a lot of brands have essentially push back to say, in the context of the pandemic, we're not going to claim these goods. And so you've pushed factories into this liquidity crunch, which means in turn they haven't been able to make payroll. And so I think just structurally, how are brands able to dump product everywhere? How are they able to buy such cheap product? How are they able to absolve themselves of risks? It's because they push the risks down to the global south, where a lot of production happens, and workers are the ones who really bear the cost of all this.
Thank you, Ayesha. Thank you, Azfar. Thank you, Kerli. Thank you for this wonderful, insightful conversation. I welcome if there's other queries. This is an ongoing conversation. We didn't come here to talk solutions. We came here to give nuance to where the conversation lies at this current point and how all of us can participate. Natalie, I hope you can share my email or my contacts with our listeners. I'd be happy to continue the conversation with some of you who've joined in. Ayesha and Azfar and Kerli, can we also give you guys as a resource? I'm sure people can continue the conversations with you guys outside the panel.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all so very much for this opportunity.
Sure, we can share your contact information with the registrants.
Yes.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, guys. Best of luck to you, and I hope this has been informative for everybody to join the conversation in sustainable fashion. Best of luck, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.